Wouldn't it be nice if your home computer was ready to use as soon as you got it home? And wouldn't it be wonderful if it came with its own green screen or full-color monitor so you didn't have to steal the television to use it? The Amstrad CPC 464, the complete home computer.
In June of 2014, the Amstrad CPC 464 home computer celebrated its 30th birthday. Released to the public on the 21st of June 1984, it entered a highly contested and oversaturated market. In the UK at the time, the reigning kings were the Sinclair ZX Spectrum and Commodore 64, with many others like the Oric, Dragon 32, BBC Micro, Apple II, Enterprise 64 and more. So enter the Amstrad. And here in this video we'll take a look at why it was a success, albeit behind the Speccy and C64, why it was different, and why it's still very much loved today, along with a little help from some friends. I speak to Retro Gamer Magazine's editor Darran Jones, gaming celebrity and Amstrad fan guru Larry Bundy Jr., retro collecting god Steve Benway, and some other YouTubing friends. Together we take a look at, celebrate and reminisce about that plucky underdog, Lord Alan Sugar's CPC 464. When it was released, the Amstrad first of all tried to visually stand out, especially those colour keys. To most people it looked good, especially to young gaming kids and gullible parents. But more importantly for once, it didn't appear to be another cheap product from Amstrad. At the time, Amstrad did have a reputation for cheap imported rubbish. This looked and felt like a serious quality computer. More importantly, Amstrad made an all-in-one solution with an integrated cassette deck and a monitor you had to buy with the machine as a package, which connected together, resulting in only one plug out to your mains. Not everyone liked that solution though, but they realised with other computers that with all their add-ons, plugs and leads, just to get its basic functions was cumbersome and annoying. So with Amstrad's earlier success with all their all-in-one hi-fi solutions, they sought to replicate this in a home computer. Amstrad were also striving for this to be a business machine and not just for at home, especially with the expansion ports allowing all number of accessories to be plugged in, a decent keyboard with numeric pad, and pushing software like word processors and spreadsheets in the demonstration tape that could be loaded up for use in shop windows. Even the excellent manual was designed to get you programming games and applications with ease. I remember as an 8 or 9 year old boy reading it from front to back, and I was programming games in BASIC pretty quickly. Everything had been very carefully thought out, despite its turbulent development period, starting in early 1983, where initially the idea had been just to rebadge an Asian Apple II clone, which was quickly dismissed. Then work started around the 6502 processor, which the Commodore 64, BBC and Apple II used. However, that was dropped when the team brought in to do that couldn't cope with the work and pressure being put on them by Mr. Sugar and Amstrad. They were replaced with Roland Perry and William Powell from a company called Ambit, who Roland of course later stayed on at Amstrad with great success, and of course gave his name to a load of Amsoft games based on the Roland character. And of course the Amstrad was codenamed the Arnold during development, which is an anagram of Roland. So Mr. Perry was obviously very well liked at Amstrad. Right, anyway, first up was getting the software sorted, which involved the basic programming language and became the basis of the operating system, which was completed by Locomotive Software brilliantly. You'll see their name when you first switch on the machine, of course. Which is where the switch to the Z80 processor occurred, because they'd already finished a Z80 version for Acorn, and converting it to a different CPU chip would mean long delays, which Amstrad did not want. During this time, the casing and design was already complete, although it was a sort of a white beige kind of look. But despite the colours, it stayed the same, and as you can see, already had the tape deck integrated into it. Next was sorting out the PCB, which Mark Eric Jones has brought in to complete, and then finally the firmware was written for the machine, and the basic interpreter was tweaked to give more easier commands to communicate with the firmware. The goal being to make Amstrad as easily as possible to program on, which was achieved along with the excellent and easy to follow 464 manual, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, so by December 1983, prototypes were being sent out nice and early to major software houses. Now, normally this was unheard of, with programmers not getting kit at all till after the release. This proved to be a masterstroke for Amstrad, with Alan Sugar demanding around 50 games to be available at launch. Very wise. And so when it was launched to the press at Westminster School, London, on the 12th of April 1984, it garnered much interest and great reviews in the press. Things were looking very, very good. Although you wouldn't want to be lumbered with a green screen monitor, it was a really cheap price point at £239, with the colour monitor package over £100 dearer at £349. But a year later these prices would drop, of course. So anyway, what did people think about it at the time, or what were their first impressions? I talked to a few people I know.
Hello there, my name is Darran Jones and I'm the editor of Retro Gamer magazine. I've been asked to take part in this to celebrate the Amstrad's 30th anniversary, and also because I'm a big fan of the machine. Well, I got my 464 for my 14th birthday, which would have been 1987, and yeah, I was absolutely blown away with it. Before that, we'd only had like consoles like the Atari 2600, and they were shared between everybody in the family. So this was a big deal because this was my computer and nobody else's. You know, my brothers and sisters weren't allowed to use it unless I said so, and I absolutely loved it. I remember being a bit annoyed at first because none of my friends, well, none of my main friends, as it were, when I was at middle school, actually had one. Everybody had Commodore 64s and Spectrums. But once I moved up to senior school, which was pretty much around about the same time, I found quite a few people with them, and it was kind of like a little band of us where we'd all borrow each other's games and stuff like that. So yeah, I've got good memories of the machine. I think I was, even back then, I knew that it wasn't the dog's bollocks as it was, and that there were issues with it. And I remember being quite annoyed that there didn't seem to be a lot of good ports with regards to many games would look exactly the same as a Speccy, but it's just like with anything, that once you actually start looking around and knowing the machine, you knew where its strengths were and you knew what games to go for. So yeah, my first memories, I think it's fair to say that I was kind of a bit upset that I had this computer that none of my friends had, but ultimately that didn't really harm my enjoyment of it, and if anything, it just basically gave me access to a more diverse library of games, because I had mine, I had ones that my friends had on the C64, and you know, my friend like Paul Elkins had a ZX Spectrum, and it was just a case of you got the best of all worlds.
Okay, the first memory I have is my older brother Sean. He told he was in charge of getting a new computer for the family. My brother's about 10 years older than me, and all I knew was I was getting a new computer because all we had previously was an old Atari VCS to play games on. So we remember going down to Dixon's in Watford one day. I think it's like the 1985. I think we went. Because it was very early when we got, because it was only the CPC 464 was out at the time. And yeah, so we went down to Dixon's in Watford and picked it up. And my first memory of it really was opening up this really, really long brown box and playing. I think the first game I played was Punchy. Punchy was the first game I played. And then I think Bridget, and then Oh Mummy. And I used to play Sultan's Maze a couple of times, but they got really, really scared, and I wouldn't play it anymore because I found it scarier. A ghost hunting you down. And then later on, the first week, I went down to Woolworths in Watford, and I picked up 2 games on budget. I picked up 180 and also Feud. I absolutely loved 180. I mean, I played it so many times I could beat the game perfectly. Actually, there's never been a better darts game than 180, really, in my opinion. But I did also get Feud, and I was absolutely shit scared of the game because I used to have nightmares of a wizard coming to get me in a maze. And I just found that incredibly scary as a kid, so I wouldn't rarely play that game.
Well, my very first experience would have been at a friend's house called Drew, and this was kind of back in the mid to late 80s, so we kind of had it that long, because obviously, you know, it's coming up to the anniversary, the 30th anniversary, so yeah, you probably only had the system for about a year or so. And my first memory of it, because I had a 6128 at the time, which is obviously the better machine, but I digress. The 464, he had a 464, and the two abiding things that really struck me about it were the keyboard, which I thought looked quite cool, you know, with like the green keys, the red keys, the blue on it as well as the obvious bit of black and white, I guess. And I just thought it looked really kind of sci-fi. It had that kind of 80s sort of feel to it, which I didn't really think it was an 80s thing at the time, but of course looking back in hindsight, looking back now, it's very much of its time, very much like kind of a zeitgeist of its era. And I just thought it looked cool, but the one thing that made me laugh about his particular CPC 464 was that he had a green monitor, and I'd never seen one of those before. And I thought he had a problem. I thought there was something wrong with his computer, like for some reason maybe the contrast was up or down or whatever. And I remember saying, look, why don't you sort your picture out? And he went, no, it's a green screen monitor. And it was the first time I'd ever experienced one, like I say. And I thought it was unusual. But of course, I look back now with the benefit of hindsight and the benefit of nostalgia and rose-tinted glasses and all the rest of it. And I think the green screen monitor looks amazing. I think it looks really cool. And one day I'd like to get one. I mean, I would never personally prioritise it over the colour monitor, but I think it's a nice alternative, and it really reminds me, not just of him and of those times, but just that whole time in general, I guess. You know, that whole 80s retro 8-bit era. So that was my very first experience, that I can think of anyway. I had another friend called Nick, who had a 464. He had a colour monitor, so that was kind of more on my level with my, again, 6128. I'm going to keep mentioning the 6128. And yeah, so that was it, pretty brief in a sense. Because I've never, even up until now, still haven't owned a 464, but certainly never say never. But those were my very first experiences with that system.
Well, unlike the company I believe I find myself in, I don't know because I can't see them, I didn't grow up with the Amstrad. My first computer was a Sinclair ZX81, then I got an Atari 2600, which isn't even a computer. Then I got an Acorn Electron, so that was pretty much it for me in the 8-bit era. I knew one person back in the day who owned an Amstrad, but I never got to try it, so I had no idea what it was like. So the first time I ever tried a CPC 464 was about 5 years ago. I wanted one for my collection of old computers and consoles, some of which you can see there behind me. Yeah, ordered one on eBay. It was with the colour monitor, it was a reasonable price. 6 months later, or thereabouts, a massive bit, you can't see how wide my arms are, very big box, getting on for the size of a washing machine, turned up at the door, and I was like, what the hell is this? I guess my very first impression of it was, oh my god, I'm struggling to get a signal out of this MP1 module. Yeah, I know there are cables and things that you can get that are supposed to be very effective, but I didn't know about that until after I'd got the MP1. Yeah, first impressions were, this is really quite awkward, just because monitor included in package.
First memory and experience of the CPC 464, well, that was probably flicking through a catalogue in the autumn of 1985, and Mum said, you know, I'll get a computer for Christmas, which was great, highly unexpected, and so I'll have that one. Didn't want a Spectrum, didn't want a Commodore, I want the Amstrad. There it was, built-in tape deck, which obviously smart, and the monitor come with it. Obviously fairly pricey, goes without saying. We did get £100 worth of software with it, so you know, I made up for it a bit, apparently. A couple of good games on that though. Random on the Ropes, Harrier Attack. Perhaps not classics, but good games, decent games at the time. Very memorable actually for me, them two, out of all that bunch. Setting up on Christmas Day, you know, plugging it in, and 10 minutes later a game's loaded, My mum actually got really into Home Mummy, oddly enough. She's really good at it too, probably better than me. But yeah, like I said, Rolling on the Ropes, probably Harry Attack, my favourite 2 out of them. Enjoyable. Yeah, had a computer finally. Had an Intellivision before that briefly, handed down to me, but got me an Amstrad. Awesome.
Overall, the CPC sold about 3 million units, and that's despite its underdog and third place status behind the Commodore 64 and Spectrum. That is still impressive figures, and if you imagine that many 464s have been sold on second hand, especially after the release of all the upgraded models like the 664, 6128 and the Plus machines, that's going to be even more millions of people having had their hands on one. Key sales went overseas to France, where the later disc-based 6128 computers sold in huge numbers, but the CPC was also popular in Spain, Germany, Greece, Norway, and even as far as Australia, although it completely flopped in America. Now, the last commercial releases from an established software house was probably in 1993, nearly 10 years after the release of the machine, which is pretty good going. There were still plenty of independent games being released from 1994 onwards, and a healthy public domain scene too. Even the long-running Amstrad Action magazine soldiered on right up until 1995, albeit it was wafer thin by then. And since the dawning of the internet, of course, a whole new batch of homebrewed games and programs were being released right up until now in a very healthy and active scene. But in its golden years, how did it fare against its competitors?
It trailed in third place. I think the entire range did around 3 million, which is a good number. I mean, it's interesting. Basically, the Atari Lynx did exactly the same, and that's considered an abject failure by a lot of people. But this isn't. It was obviously massively behind the Commodore 64 and Speccy, like I've already said. But you know, I've kind of always liked an underdog, and that's the main reason why I got into the Lynx, because, you know, everybody else had a Game Boy, so, you know, I'll be different, I'll have an Atari Lynx. And that decision was taken away from me with the Amstrad, because it was basically my nan who bought it for me, and, you know, she's not very tech savvy. I mean, she's 92 now, but she certainly wasn't tech savvy when she bought it. And it was a case of she would have obviously gone to the shop wherever she got it from, and she would have been bamboozled by the salesman there that, oh yeah, you don't need to worry about the colour monitor, you know, the green screen's more than adequate for what your grandson wants. And so that's what I ended up with. So yeah, I knew it wasn't popular because it was a nightmare trying to find people who owned one. But on the other hand, though, it was still better than a BBC or a Dragon 32 or a VIC 20 or a Commodore 16. Again, simply based on the fact that I knew hardly anybody with those machines. So at least there was like a handful of kids at school who did have an Amstrad, even if the vast majority of them had had Commodore 64s or Spectrums.
Well, at the time, I had no knowledge at all whatsoever about, you know, which one was doing better, because most of my friends at school had Amstrads as well. I didn't know anybody who had a Spectrum or a Commodore 64 back then. There was a kid at school called Gavin Davis, and he had a CPC 6128, which I was really jealous about. But the only plus side was he only had a green screen monitor for it, so I did used to laugh at him about that. If you look at the statistics, really, it wasn't as popular. It was probably definitely the third place out of all three of them. But like I said at the time, I just didn't know. I just thought it was... I didn't even think about competition at the time, really. But like I said, it was the third best, but it didn't deserve to be third best. I mean, it's like a Super Spectrum, to be honest. I mean, it's very similar architecture and stuff like that. So that's what it felt like to me. But yes, it was third place out of the three. Unless you count the Sam Coupe, which nobody does. But yeah, it was the third place, but it didn't deserve to be third place because it was far superior to both the Spectrum and the Commodore 64, sort of, if you look at graphics, stuff like that.
I would say not as successful as it could have been and should have been, in that technically impressive, graphically superior to the Spectrum, and in some ways to the Commodore 64, and now there are going to be parties who are fans of both of those jumping up and down and screaming at me. Well, I'm sorry, but it just is. It's nice and colourful, you don't get the colour clash, and the resolution is decent. Sound, meh. But it came too late, and the inclusion and requirement of the monitor, to my mind, was stupid. I get the idea. It was like if little Bobby wanted to play on his computer and the rest of the family were watching the telly, there was no conflict of interest. He had a monitor there. But that made it really bloody expensive, and Amstrad finally cottoned on to this by releasing the MP1, I guess. Did they release the computer without it, or whatever? Yeah, and I mean, by the time it came out, what was it, 84? It was kind of late in the day. Sinclair were completely dominating in the UK, and Commodore had a very good foothold. Well, more than a foothold. They had a good, healthy market share. America, did it even get released there? I mean, it did well in Germany. But not nearly as successful as it could have been. Should have been released 2 years earlier without the monitor, in my opinion. Built-in modulator, that would have been cool. Would have been, I think, more successful. But, you know, hindsight has 20/20 vision, as they say.
Well, if you don't mind, I'll include all Amstrads in this. So the 464, 6128 and whatever else for that matter. Because I think you can kind of, cluster them all in for the purpose of this debate. And I think you've got to remember, at least this is how I interpreted at the time. I'm not an expert on the business models or even on Amstrad, Commodore, Spectrum, or Sinclair. I'm not an expert on that, but just my interpretation. I think the Amstrad was aimed more at business people. You know, it was kind of like an office computer. It's what businesses would buy. You know, Alan Sugar's behind all this. That's kind of, what he did, what he does. And I think the Commodore 64 and the ZX Spectrum were primarily game systems. Yes, they could do other things, but they were primarily for games players, whereas the Amstrad, I think, was primarily for business users, but it can also play games. Which is kind of the best of both worlds, but the problem with that, I think, is that the Amstrad was far and away more expensive, and of course that's going to put a lot of people off. I think another issue, and I could have this wrong, I'm sure everybody, seeing as this is an Amstrad vid, will be very quick to tell me, but I think the Amstrad, you had to have it plugged into a monitor, and you couldn't connect it to a TV, whereas with the Spectrum and the Commodore 64 you could. So again, you're saving all that money on the setup and the monitor. You can just plug it into your telly downstairs or in your bedroom or wherever, and I think that was a massive advantage to the Commodore 64 and the ZX Spectrum, and a disadvantage, obviously, to the Amstrad. So I still think it was successful, but it depends how you view it, because I'm sure on a business level it was very successful. I don't think you would have went into many offices and buildings and seen like a Commodore 64. I think you probably would have seen an Amstrad. But in terms of games, I think they were all kind of on an equal footing, I think. But the one thing, even at the time, I've got to be honest, it will always grate with me this. The one thing at the time is, and it still happens now, even on YouTube, when people talk about the 8-bit computer, home computer era, people talk about the Commodore 64 and the Spectrum, and hardly anyone mentions the Amstrad, and I don't know why that is. Because it was, even though it was the most expensive of the three systems, it still sold well. Even as a game system, I knew a lot of people who had them. Granted, I knew more who had a Commodore 64 and a Spectrum, but I knew a lot of people who had an Amstrad. So it's always kind of rankled a little bit with me, how people always kind of neglect to mention it when they talk about the 8-bit era. It's almost like it doesn't exist. Now maybe it's because the Commodore 64 and Spectrum owners were a bit jealous. Could be that. Maybe, maybe not, I don't know.
I think it's pretty common knowledge. It was like the third best seller out of three. Commodore and Spectrum have been around the best part of 2 years before the Amstrad. That was the Amstrad's, I wouldn't quite say downfall, I'd be wrong, but one of its faults was it's just too slow, really. I mean, no doubt for me, the Amstrad had almost the best of both of them in some ways. I think colour, very vibrant colours compared to the washed out a load of Commodore. Obviously Spectrum was only 4-colour. Of course, common knowledge, I mean 20% I think of the Amstrad games, maybe like 20, but were Speccy ports, which was such a shame. But I think it done alright, you know. It's a cult following. If you looked in the shops, you know, back then, I mean, shops like John Menzies. I used to go in John Menzies for a few of my games. Others like Boots, things like that. You had Commodore, Spectrum, and you had Amstrad more than anything else. Rather, it's like the BBC and even the Atari home range. But yeah, the Amstrad done alright in my view.
So, on to the all-important gaming. Now, Sir Alan, unlike Sir Clive Sinclair, recognised games were key to success. So at the launch of the machine, he had already formed his own software company called Amsoft, and as previously mentioned, brought programmers in early to write or port existing games ready for the launch, and something around 50 games were ready at the time, I believe. Sure, not all of them were good, but games like Roland on the Ropes, 3D Grand Prix, Harry Attack and a few others were great. However, most were below average to the truly abysmal like Home Runner and Bridget. But that wasn't the point. If a good range of games weren't available when the computer was on sale in shops, it wouldn't inspire confidence with both the public or other games publishers, with so many people suspicious after flops like the Auric and the Dragon 32, both of which had gone or were going bust. So Amstrad really made sure that the CPC was at least the third machine, at the least, that games publishers developed and released games for. And it didn't take long after Amsoft for independent programmers to start to master the machine slowly and bring out some brilliant games. And of course the inevitable flurry of arcade conversions and movie licenses. As you can see here, we have some notable releases like RoboCop, Prince of Persia, Chase HQ, Head Over Heels, Gryzor, Renegade, Turrican, Werewolves of London, Dizzy, Shinobi, Batman, Double Dragon 2, Super Cauldron, Prehistoric 2, Lemmings, Operation Wolf, and many, many more we can show and mention. However, Amstrad gaming has been criticised heavily over time, mostly for three main things. Now, number one, the first being the problem with scrolling. Now, whilst the Amstrad is capable of decent smooth scrolling, it's very difficult to achieve with no real dedicated hardware scrolling or hardware sprite support like the Commodore 64 had. Plus, of course, the lack of memory available. A few years into the CPC 464's life, it started to get a really bad reputation for this, most notably springing up from the Green Beret conversion, which some multi-format magazines at the time latched onto, basically labelling the 464 the computer that can't scroll games. We of course know this not to be true in the hands of a skilled programmer who isn't being rushed for a deadline. Number two, the second criticism being blocky graphics, which comes from the Amstrad's Mode 0 screen mode, which allowed up to 16 colours on screen but a smaller resolution with chunkier pixels. There was Mode 1, which had a high resolution but a choice of only 4 colours, which quite a lot of games did use. But for the majority of CPC users, we preferred the highly colourful Mode 0, and designed with care it could look amazing. For example, games like Night Force and Gryzor. However, notable poor use of Mode 0 can be found in games like eSWAT and especially Thunderblade, which Amstrad Action magazine memorably at the time described it as looking like an explosion in a Lego factory. Number three, the third and final main criticism was the large number of Speccy ports, i.e. games that were already written for the ZX Spectrum being ported and converted over to the Amstrad with little or no changes. This resulted in dull looking Mode 1 graphics in 4 colours and often less colourful than the Speccy original, and in most cases, unfortunately, played slower than the Speccy version. Now, nothing makes an Amstrad fan more angry than coming across a goddamn Speccy port. Now, this was of course the fault of greedy and lazy software companies looking to quickly churn out products. The Amstrad Inspection, of course, had a similar internal architecture, which made porting across quite quick and easy. Examples of bad Speccy ports were games like R-Type, Bionic Commando, Last Ninja 2, Pit Fighter, Cabal, Pac-Mania, Black Tiger, etc. However, there were some good examples with like Head Over Heels and Myth, and also even in reverse. Even Amstrad developed games could be ported over to the Speccy instead, like for example the Dizzy series that started life on the Amstrad. So there's no doubting though that given such a huge library of games that the Amstrad CPC 464 is a brilliant gaming computer. But what were people's most memorable or favourite games from the time? Let's ask my chums.
I had loads. I used to really enjoy playing Exor, although I was rubbish at it. Absolutely adored Get Dexter. I was a big fan of Ultimates games, so I'd buy all the ones that came out on Amstrad, even though they were normally nowhere as good as the Speccy ones. I loved the Dizzy games. In fact, it was my love of Dizzy games that got me into collecting Codemaster games in general. And at one stage I had a complete collection, which I sadly no longer have. I really liked the conversions. Robocop was really, really good at the Amstrad. I'll swear to my dying breath that the Chase HQ on Amstrad is miles better than the Spectrum version, although that itself is very good. Donkey Kong was brilliant on the Amstrad. Outrun was terrible. Oh god, I was gutted when Outrun came out. It's probably one of the worst games on the machine I've ever played. Up there with The Apprentice as well. That was terrible. Game Over looked amazing, but it obviously played really poorly. You had well, most of the Dynamics games were like that, to be fair. I was a big fan of Backtron, which was another isometric game. Sweevo's World. In fact, I liked a lot of isometric games back then. I don't play them as much now, but there was a lot of good Ocean stuff. I pretty much picked up most of the big Ocean licenses just because I just thought they were really slick. Big fan of Sorcery. I always remember being upset with the Amstrad though, because I used to love shoot 'em ups, and all the good shoot 'em ups seemed to be on the C64. And the Amstrad, you know, it had things like Synapse, which was really good, and Cybernoid was smart. But really, it was the C64 where all the really good games were. At least in terms of my favourite genre.
Most memorable games for me, I definitely really loved playing Jack the Nipper 2 as a kid. Absolutely loved it. I mean, I used to boot up the game just to listen to the title screen music. You know, it used to play Baby Elephant Walk, wasn't it, the music? Yeah. So yeah, I used to love playing that game. Absolutely terrible. I didn't know what the hell I was doing in it, but I just loved playing it. And I think that was the majority of most of the Amstrad games at the time. I didn't know what I was doing, and just having fun. I remember my mum, she found a couple of Amstrad games in Oxfam. One of them was Metro Cross. I used to play that a lot. I used to love playing Metro Cross. And this French game, I don't know the name of it, but you're in prison. And you can only sort of sneak out about the building at night, because in the daytime there's robots parading and they kill you instantly. I just can't remember the name of it, but I used to play that a lot. But other than that, I think the old big old Ocean games are quite popular for me. I used to love playing Chase HQ and Rainbow Islands, and also New Zealand Story. I used to love playing New Zealand Story, mainly because my friends had it on the Amiga and I only had the Amstrad version still, but it just didn't matter to me back then. I still had loads of fun buying it. I actually bought it off the back of them, off the Amiga version, which seems a bit silly in hindsight, but I didn't own an Amiga until much later, the early 90s, and I got an Amiga 600 then. But that's not the question, is it? What else did I remember playing that was quite memorable? I shall have to have a think. Okay, Animal, Vegetable, Mineral. I used to get loads of laughs out of that, mainly as I used to enter teachers' names that I didn't like instead, so I used to keep saying teachers' names I didn't like, and I found that the absolute height of hilarity. Don't know why. But I think that I used to go down my local newsagents to get their budget games and stuff like that. I always remember buying things like Chucky Egg and things like that. What else? But other than that, I used to like buying the compilation sets. We used to go down to not Woolworths. We used to get them in Boots. Stuff like 10 Great Games and John Menzies as well. I used to get them in John Menzies. I always remember getting really depressed that I bought this 10-pack and it had Mask on it, but the Mask didn't work, and that was one of the ones I was really looking forward to. So yes, so that's one of the things. But yes, so I think compilations is where I bought most of my games as well. Most of the like the big ones. But then I used to get the budget games from like local news agents and stuff like that.
Well, I have played quite a few games. I got to admit, I still got a lot that I haven't played. I've got a load of, they're still in the boxes, Mastertronic budget titles, read them. No, you can't, I've got reflection on it. Yeah. You tell me, are any of these any good? Because I don't know. I know that one is. Well, it is on the Electron. Anyway, but yeah, most memorable. Well, there are three that come to mind, actually. My favourite is 3D Grand Prix. I'm just gobsmacked by that. It's that whopping great big sprite in the bottom third of the screen that represents your car, like the front wing, and the wheels, they turn. Because wheels don't normally turn, do they? Yeah, and then the opponent car sprites, they just, well, I mean, they start off in the distance, tiny little things, and then by the time you get right up behind them, they're huge. And I'd not seen anything like that on another 8-bit computer. They've probably done that game on the other computers and do exactly the same thing, but it blew me away. Difficult passing the other cars, but I don't care. I think in terms of the sprite handling on there, it was brilliant. Other memorable games, Roland on the Ropes. It's just fun and looks good. It's got a lot of character. And utterly craptastic Harrier Attack. I don't know what it is about that game. I mean, it's clunky, it's not especially smooth in its movement, but I like it. I think I might upset some people in saying it's so bad it's good. There'll be some people who think it's good, but I enjoy it.
Well, I've got a list here. It's quite a long list, but I'll quickly go through them. I may stop for a few seconds on one or two. But the first one that I've got to mention, in fact, if I just kind of circle them here, it was a 5-star. It was called 5-Star Games. It was like a compilation. And the reason I mention this, it was the very first game, or games, because it was on one compilation, that I ever got. And it comprised of the following 5 games. The best one, without question, Who Dares Wins 2. So kind of like an Ikari Warriors top-down shooter, or a Mercs, or, that kind of thing. And I was even playing it the other day via emulation. And it's brilliant. It looks the part, it plays well, it's really addictive. It's a challenge, it's not too difficult, it's not too easy, it's just about right. And it was my favourite game, probably because it was the first one I played, so there's that, natural kind of, I guess, gravitas towards nostalgia and rose-tinted glasses. But yeah, there was that one on there. Who Dares Wins 2, Spin Dizzy, which was really hard, but I loved it. 3 Weeks in Paradise, kind of like an adventure game, sort of like an RPG, if you like, on the 8-bit system. Equinox, which I was never very good at. And Zoids. Now, Zoids at the time, for anyone who remembers, of course, was a cartoon, and it was also they also had the little toys that they made. And I watched the cartoon because I was that kind of age that they were marketing towards at the time. So I watched the cartoon, I had the toys, but I could never get into the game. And I tried and I tried and I tried, and every single time I put it on, I just didn't have a clue what I was doing. It was too difficult. It's that kind of like Vectrex kind of polygon-y kind of look to it. And for me, it didn't work. Now, I've not played it since I was a kid. I may go back to it now and think, this is quite good, but I doubt it. I just didn't like it then, and I don't think I ever will. So those are my first games that I remember. Like I say, particularly Who Dares Wins 2, an absolute classic. And I urge anyone, if you've got an Amstrad and you've never played Who Dares Wins 2, you've got to get it. Download it, buy it, do what you've got to do to get it. It's absolutely brilliant. Other ones, Shinobi, I thought was a really good conversion. Lotus Esprit Turbo Challenge, a brilliant game. Now I should say with these as well is, I'm sure they were all out on the 464, that's the purpose of this vid. They were certainly all out on the 6128, but I think for the 6128 some of these would have been graphically and maybe sonically touched up a little bit, because of the improved kind of power, if you like, behind the system. But I'm sure all of these were on the 464, because some of these obviously are very old. I think they all worked. So that's that. Yeah, Lotus Esprit Turbo Challenge was a brilliant game. Loved that. Me and my friend would play it for hours and hours and hours at a time. Winter Games, I think, was it made by Epix? And the graphics on that at the time blew me away. And even looking at it now, and Zypho, I know you've done a video of this, because I remember watching it absolutely ages ago. The graphics, even now, look brilliant. Look absolutely brilliant. And yeah, you could have your figure skating on there, the bobsleigh, whatever else. Was the skeet shooting, or no, the biathlon, whatever else. And it was a really, really good game. And quite responsive, I think, when it comes to the controls. But the most impressive thing there was, like I say, graphically. The lighting, the snow, it just looked really, really nice for an 8-bit game. New Zealand Story, Paperboy, Turrican was an absolutely brilliant game. Ghosts and Goblins, the music on that was fantastic. Playability was really, really good. Very tricky, but still it had that kind of like addictiveness about it. West Bank, which I think was known in the arcades as, oh my god, what was it called? Gas something. What am I talking about? Panic Bank? I can't remember. I've just got a bit dyslexic there. Maybe it was the other way around, not sure. But West Bank was a really good game. Super Robin Hood, absolutely brilliant. And I've wrote there in brackets by Codemasters, and I think, probably got this wrong, but I think that was Codemasters' very first game that they ever published. And again, if you've got an Amstrad or you want to get one, Super Robin Hood, it looks really good. The music is fantastic. Still, I was watching it again the other day, just in case the memory was playing tricks, but it's still really, really good, so check that one out. Druid, oh man alive. Druid is one of my favourite games on the Amstrad of all time. Again, it was another one I actually had on the same day when I got my Amstrad in 86 or 87 at Christmas. Even though I played Who Dares Wins 2, that was the first game I played, there's a couple of other games that I did get, and Druid was one of them. And it's kind of like a gauntlet, essentially. It's a bit of a rip-off, but it's a really good game, nice sound, addictive playability. It's a really, really good game. So Druid, got to check that one out. Batman the movie, so we're looking at about 89, 1990 now. But that graphically was brilliant. Still looks really, really good now. Emlyn Hughes International Soccer. My favourite football game on any system. And I'm not saying the Amstrad version. It's my favourite Amstrad football game. But Emlyn Hughes on the Amiga, the Atari ST, absolutely brilliant. I remember playing it on the Commodore 64. I was going on about it for so long because I had it on the Amstrad, and I convinced my friend to buy it on his C64. And he played well, it was a good game, he liked it, I liked it. But the thing that I always remember about the C64 version is the players were blockier, and it's like they wore vests, like Australian rules rugby, Australian rules football, I guess. And it just looked ridiculous. The Amstrad sprites looked brilliant, but they were tiny, but it looked really, really good. But Emlyn Hughes International Soccer, a brilliant football game, possibly, arguably, I'm biased, but arguably the most playable football game on the Amstrad, without question actually. Microprose Soccer, yeah, I remember buying that. Now this is funny because I was just talking about the Commodore 64 there. On the Commodore 64, Microprose Soccer is amazing. It looks brilliant, sounds brilliant, it's a brilliant game. And after playing it on my friend's C64, I thought I'm going to get that on the Amstrad. Now when I did, it wasn't as good. Playability's fine, graphically it's a bit of a mess, but it had the replays, which I always thought was really cool and kind of futuristic. And it had like the thunder and lightning and the rain effects, which impressed me a lot, to be fair, but it was just kind of like the monochrome background. It was like playing it on a green screen monitor, like I was talking about before. Just a few more to go through. Football Manager 2, which was a brilliant game, and I had the expansion kit as well that a friend got me for my birthday, I think in '89, which is brilliant. Barbarian, Chase HQ, fantastic game, absolutely love that. Sorcery, now I don't know if a lot of people are aware of Sorcery, but you've got to check that out. It's an early game, but it was so good, so in-depth, I loved it anyway. And I'm sorry to harp on about the 6128 again, but the 6128 got a better version. I say better, I think they added more levels because you could put it on the disc and all that kind of stuff. It's still essentially the same game, but a really, really good game. Another two, Cauldron 1 and Cauldron 2, the sequel, brilliant, involving like the witch and flying around and collecting all the potions and whatever else. And the last two that I've got on the list, even though it's kind of one, it's the first game and the second game in the series, is Saboteur, which when I first saw it graphically, it looked really, really nice. Just the animation looked clever, and it was a really, really hard game, which is quite indicative, I guess, of a lot of old 8 and 16-bit games. They were very, very hard, very challenging, but really rewarding if you managed to complete it. Now, I can't remember if I completed Saboteur, or at least without a cheat mode anyway, but those games were rock hard. So there's many more. I could name thousands well, certainly hundreds anyway, of CPC games that maybe I played on a 464 to friends, or whether it was on my 6128. I could go on all day, quite frankly, but those are just, 20, 25 maybe, that I personally love, which I think have aged quite well, although again, as I say, I'm probably a little bit biased when it comes to the old rose-tinted glasses.
I have about 500 games, regional actual games. And of course, you've got emulators on the laptops and stuff like that, which has, best part of 2000 probably. I've took out a few I'm going to quickly run through, very quickly. Probably stick out, but I could have easily done another 50 or something like that. So, very quickly, from the early days then, 3D Star Strike, which was Star Wars, which looked awesome at the time, going through them trenches. This was Star Wars before Star Wars was on Amstrad or any computer, and probably done a better job in my view. Moving on, Defend or Die, which is Defender of course. It just says age 9 plus on that. Nice clamshell case in some of these as well. This isn't actually a memorable game for me, but I just got it out because something you might have seen. Original Amsoft boxes. There they are. Just the Amsoft game like them up there, but in a big box. Quite rare to see these days. First actual game I actually went to a shop to buy after Christmas was this, a 5-star compilation. Spin Dizzy, 3 Weeks in Paradise, Who Dares Wins 2, Zoids and Equinox. 5 games for £10 instead of one big game. There it was. Some good games on there too. Budget games, I used to, again my mum, go around the market with her to carry her shopping at the local market, which doesn't exist anymore, and she'd buy me a budget game. So they always get a couple of good budget games. Mission Genocide, it's a vertical scrolling super smooth shooter. Super smooth scrolling. Shooting's alright. Destructo, which is Arpo done a gameplay of. Brilliant game, check it out if you haven't. The Amstrad version easily beats the others. Big box games. The Amstrad got a really good conversion of Grisor. Missing a couple of bits, but it's a bit colourful, as you can probably see from that, just about. Mask, probably like Mask, awful to control, but a really good game and fantastic music too. Amstrad got a good conversion of Chase HQ. Commodore didn't. Also got one Smash TV. Not sure about the Commodore. Cross that, alright, Commodore won that one. But the Amstrad version, really good too. Absolutely brilliant horizontal scrolling shooter for the Amstrad. Big bosses on it. Hardly bested to this day as well. This went too far behind though. P47 Thunderbolt. Size of that box for a tape. Unreal, isn't it? Here we go. Stunt Car Racer. Pretty good on the Amstrad, has to be said. 2 more games quickly. Pretty good Star Glider. Pretty awesome Star Glider. This was like a 3D roaming Star Wars. Some walkers and stuff like that as well. Impressive for its day. And the game that took up my childhood was Elite, without a doubt. They tell me I'm 40 years old, right? So like in 6 months and then 40 years spent playing Elite. So there we go. Plenty more games I could easily mention, but we'll get on with the video.
The CPC 464 paved the way for a whole line of computers from Amstrad, most notably being the CPC 6128 with its disk drive and extra memory, which is arguably the one to own. Of course, then onto the revamped Plus machines and the ill-fated GX4000 console. But for Amstrad from its beginnings with the CPC 464, it really elevated the company in the public mind from cheap hi-fi importers to serious players in the market. And the 464 was the launch pad to even bigger success of its PCW line of computers and then their own PCs. But back to the machine of the hour, the legacy of the CPC 464 still carries on today, of course. Since the late 90s, thanks to the popularisation of the internet, people have been discovering, or indeed rediscovering, what a great machine it is. With practically every game ever released dumped and available to download along with emulators to play them on modern PCs, plus eBay to buy the real hardware and games, and with forums and Facebook to discuss and chat about the CPC, Even today in 2014, new games and new demos are still being written and released by people. And it must have been inconceivable for someone buying the machine new in 1984 and seeing the original Welcome demo and Amsoft games that this was even possible. And so, with retro gaming in general especially more popular than ever before and a wider population checking out the machine, it seems finally consensus is shifting from the misconception that this was a cheaply made and poor machine with rubbish games to something standing equally as tall, if not taller in places, to its more successful rivals. So that's my view, but what are other people's lasting impressions of the 464?
I like it. I think it's well designed, well made, reliable. The CPU is powerful enough. The graphics are colourful with a decent resolution. The sound, well, it's not up there with the Commodore 64 or even the Atari 8-bit, but it certainly beats the hell out of the Spectrum and, well, the ZX81. Really, I only have one reservation about it. And that is the display connectivity. The requirement of a monitor, to my mind, is stupid. But as a rule, I like it. I prefer it to the Spectrum. I prefer it to the Commodore 64. Fans of both of those will now be screaming at me, but I don't care. Truth is, I'm an Atari and an Acorn man at heart, but of what were probably the big three, Sinclair, Commodore and Amstrad, in the UK back in the day, yeah, if I had to choose one of those three, I probably would go for the Amstrad. Still rather have an Electron.
It was my childhood. It was my school years, after school, and during sometimes. Meaning geography field trips, I'd end up going home with my friend and playing Matchday 2 instead. Yeah, it was my childhood. It's fantastic memories, a real nostalgia buzz. Only possibly matched by the Amiga itself, which obviously the Amstrad had gone by then, more or less. But always in here. Yeah, it was a fantastic machine, I think it was. It's just a shame it's 2 years too late on most of the things it did. Same with the console, GX4000.
The 464 paved the way brilliantly for the superior 6128, which came out a couple of years later. And I mean that with complete sincerity. I don't mean it with disrespect. I think it did. It paved the way. It was the introduction, if you like, into the Amstrad franchise, the Amstrad series, the Amstrad home computer, and it got a lot of people interested. And they corrected a few things. They ironed out a few problems. They improved it, and they released the later models. So that's how I'd quickly sum that up. But if I just maybe talk about last impressions of the Amstrad in general, so this will incorporate the 464 as well. But I do think the fact that it wasn't maybe marketed as much as the Commodore 64 and the Spectrum, and the fact that it was more expensive, I think that alienated a lot of people. You know, a lot of parents, a lot of adults would have went out and they would have probably looked at all the prices and naturally would have plumped for the cheaper option, probably the Spectrum or the Commodore 64. So the Amstrad was kind of lagging behind a bit, but then it wasn't, I don't think, marketed at the time towards gamers, because, you know, gaming back then was very niche, wasn't it? It's not like now where it's aimed at everybody. It doesn't matter whether you're a young kid or a pensioner. Anyone plays games these days. It's becoming more and more acceptable. But back then, it was very much a niche thing and very much, I guess, for kids. So I think the Amstrad sold well, but usually it was just, I guess, for businesses, for offices and all that kind of stuff. But I think last impression, I think it's got a legacy. But I do think, and I'm trying to be as objective as possible, and I can't say that it finishes in first place. For me, it would, because I'm biased. But I think if you're looking at it objectively, I think you'd have to get the bronze medal behind probably the Commodore 64, then the Spectrum, then the Amstrad. But there's room for three. And the best kind of modern day analogy I can use, it's a bit like the Xbox One, the PlayStation 4, and the Wii U. Now, they're all brilliant bits of kit. They all offer something pretty much the same, but something different as well. But there's room for all three. If you want to get all three, yeah, one's going to sell better than the other and all the rest of it. Technically, one's going to be better than the other. They're all going to be different, of course. That's just the way it is. But I think there's room for three, and there was certainly room for three, back in the day. But as I also touched upon earlier on, one of my main gripes was, and probably always will be, that when people talk about the 8-bit era, they always mention the Commodore 64 and the Spectrum, and very rarely do they mention, or at least give enough credit, I think, to the CPC, because it was a brilliant system and is. And it's one which, over time, I'm definitely going to get back into. I've got the emulation, I can play any game via emulation, but I would like to get the real deal. I know it's going to be pricey and all the rest of it, but it's something I want to do, because it was my very first computer. I specifically wanted one. You know, I can remember where I was when we bought it, or before we bought it, I guess. I remember when we first saw it, and I said, I want to get one of those for Christmas. And I've got strong nostalgia for it, because it was my first computer, my first foray into gaming, if you like. So I've got that, the Amstrad, to be thankful for forever.
I think it does deserve a lot more recognition than what it got in the end. It's always been the one that people talk about the least. I mean, it does deserve far more recognition than what it's got. I mean, the only really recognition it has outside of Europe for the Americans and stuff like that is just drifting memories of the GX4000 that some people have got on import, and just because it flops so hard and stuff like that. So that's quite a bad sort of lasting legacy, really, the GX4000, for anybody outside who didn't grow up with the Amstrad to remember it, really. Since I grew up with the Amstrad, it's always sort of the one I have fondest memories of. It's always going to be the 8-bit system for me growing up. Thank you. Okay, I've been Guru Larry. Goodbye, and good gaming. And happy birthday, Amstrad CPC. Happy birthday, Amstrad.
Well, my lasting impression is a great computer. Yes, it wasn't as good as the C64 and the Spectrum in terms of its sheer commercial appeal, the variety of games. I mean, one of the things that's always annoyed me with the Amstrad is that there was never really amazing exclusives. You had stuff like Get Dexter, but most of the cool stuff was happening overseas, and I didn't really see a lot of it until I got onto Retro Game and realised just how diverse and what sort of cool stuff a lot of the other countries were doing. But yeah, I distinctly remember it being an underdog. Even now, it's still looked at as an underdog. A lot of people, particularly on the forums, will just write it off. Yes, there was problems. It didn't always scroll as well as it could, but you've only got to look at things like Renegade and Greiser, for example, to see that, you know, when it wanted to, it could make absolutely amazing Amstrad arcade conversions. So yeah, you know, I'm not going to lie, the Amstrad CPC wasn't perfect, but I loved it. I still love it. Basically, an underdog which even now, 30 years on, still doesn't get the respect which I think it deserves. So yeah, so I hope this has been of use to you. You know, we put the Amstrad in the magazine whenever we can, although we don't litter the mag with it, because ultimately, you know, I know its place. For example, I'd never be foolish enough to put the Amstrad on the cover, because I know that there just wasn't the market for it. But it will always have a special place in my heart, and judging by the people who are watching this video, the same can be said as well for you guys. You hopefully you love the machine as much as I do. So this is Darran Jones from Retro Gamer Magazine. Thanks very much for your time. See you soon. Bye.
Alright guys, and yes, it's me, Zypho. Just want to say thanks for watching, and thank you to everyone who contributed to this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you haven't already, go and download an emulator and a bunch of games, or even better, go and buy a CPC bundle from eBay and experience this wonderful machine for real. Whilst it's hard to argue which is the best gaming 8-bit home computer, I'd certainly argue that the CPC was the best all-round computer. So thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and happy birthday to the CPC 464. Thanks, goodbye.